Hi, and welcome to this SOLAS webinar. We're so glad you've decided to join us. The question that we're going to be looking at this lunchtime for the next hour is, wouldn't the world be a better place without religion? It's a really big, a really important and complex question, and we're going to delve into that this lunchtime. Obviously, one of the common charges that critics of faith, particularly critics of Christianity, put to us regularly is the idea that, as Christopher Hitchens put it, religion poisons everything. Well, was he right? The accusations are many. One is that belief systems inevitably divide the world into categories of them and us, those who believe and those who don't, and that can therefore make otherwise good people discriminate against other people, the in-group and the out-group, even to the point perhaps of hatred or violence. The other big criticism that often comes is the idea that the concept of divine revelation puts knowledge beyond human scrutiny. So if somebody wants to fly a plane into the Twin Towers and claim that they're doing so because God told them to, that is above rational discussion. So the idea there is that any claim to divine revelation is profoundly toxic. So does religion poison everything? Joining me to discuss these important questions today, we've got two excellent guests who I think are going to really help us to unpack some of these ideas. The first is a new guest for our SOLAS webinar, Lara Buchanan, she grew up in South Africa, where she, as you'll discover in a few moments, saw all the side effects of religion, some good and some bad, like religious justification for discrimination in the apartheid era. Now, she studied history, English literature, and theology, and speaks widely on these subjects for people like RZIM and the OCA down in Oxford. Welcome, Lara. How are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on this webinar today.
Great to have you. Our other speaker this lunchtime is Gareth Black, who, if you've been on Solus webinars, you're well aware of Gareth. Now, Gareth grew up in a different context. Gareth grew up in Northern Ireland at the tail end of the Troubles, where he too saw some of the negative effects of the way that religion can reinforce identities which can be used in tribal-style conflicts. Gareth, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you, Gavin. Great to be with you again. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Now, of what we always say at this point in these webinars is that, as well as having great speakers, your contributions as viewers are really, really important to the shape of these webinars. We will let Lara and Gareth get into some of these questions in a second, but the second half of our webinar, we would love you to be involved in shaping the discussion. And the way that you can do that is through a little system we've got called Pigeonhole. So if you, on your web browser, go to pigeonhole.at, that's a little question and answer panel. If you open that up and type in the code SOLAS 6 August, so SOLAS number 6 August, that will open up the Q&A panel for this webinar, and you can put any of your questions, as long as they're polite. Any question is good, and you can put that to Lara and Gareth, and we will work through as many of those questions as we can, and you can really be involved in the way that this discussion goes over the next hour. The one thing to add to that is, if you go into Pigeonhole and you see a question and that looks particularly good, or that was the question you were going to ask, you can vote for it and it will come up to the top of the list and be much more likely to get seen. Now, our producer today, the amazing Tim, he will put those codes up at some point for us, so that if you missed that Pigeonhole and code, that will come up on the screen. So don't worry if you missed that. We've only got an hour, so let's dig straight into this topic. You're our guest today, Lara, so can I start with you? The critics of religion point to things like your upbringing in the context of white South Africa as perhaps a case in point of everything that's wrong with religion. Could you tell us a little about what your experience was there and how it affected you and other people too?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it definitely helps to start here, because this has had a huge impact on how I've thought about these questions. So yeah, I grew up in South Africa, and I was 9 years old actually when apartheid was disbanded. So my whole upbringing, up until the sort of the first decade of my life, I lived in a white-only area. There were only white people at my school, white-only church. So all of the codified racial laws that the apartheid regime had, and I think the truth is that the apartheid regime called itself Christian, and it backed up its racial laws using the Bible. And yeah, I guess this very specific codified version of the racialized laws was built upon the racial ideologies that came from the earliest times with the European settlers and then the colonial project. So I guess the way it impacted me was my parents, my pastors, my church told me when I was growing up that it was wrong, that these beliefs were wrong. But what I realized was that my Christian ancestors had begun these, these laws had kind of come in with Christendom, and as I said, in very specific ways in apartheid. So I think from my earliest time realized that the church could be so involved and in both starting and perpetuating injustice, and I was just living with that paradox of what I saw in the Bible and then what I'd also seen in history and in where I was living.
That's fascinating. Gareth, what about you? Any similarities with that growing up in Northern Ireland? So you must have been pretty young when the Troubles ended, I guess, but any similarities, or was it different in your context?
Well, thank you, Gavin. Yes, I was quite young when the Troubles ended. Not similarity in terms of the specific issue of racism, I would say, but certainly a similarity at the broader level of what it looks like to grow up in a polarized society that creates kind of us and them narratives and culture wars, and certainly one that appears to have sort of religious belief as one of its causal factors. I, as you say, Gavin, grew up in the final years of what were 30 years of sectarian violence that devastated Northern Ireland, and it's well documented. And sort of depending on what side of the community you grew up in, often you were influenced, often unconsciously, to sort of understand and relate to those of other communities and political persuasions as with suspicion, I would say, and with a good degree of prejudice. And of course, I guess that's, there was a strong religious dynamic to that division. And of course, many people would say that, this is the unacceptable product of religion. I think even Richard Dawkins in page 1 of the God Delusion, his famous book, basically makes the case that without religion, there would be no Northern Ireland trouble. So I understand all that. And it raised questions for me as a young guy growing up in a Christian family. Because there was a conflation with Christianity. Some of the most vocal and biggest unionist voices were clergymen, and among Protestants, the conflict was often framed in sort of religious ways. This wasn't just a political conflict. This was for God and Ulster. And so this was about faithfulness to God's kingdom, and it's not too much of a jump to go from those ideas to sort of fanning the flames of violence. And of course, that wasn't so much the context or the experience on the other side, but of course, there have been other problems in Catholic and nationalist communities with institutional abuse, things that were going on by those who were entrusted with particularly young people who sort of associated themselves and identified through Christianity, who did heinous things. And that was then compounded by the institution and Catholic hierarchies covering up with some of the things. So whether it's at that kind of macro level of those who bear the name of Jesus, fueling flames of bitterness, or people being abused by clergy, or whether it's even at the micro level of just individuals' bitter experience of even Christian parents or Christian leaders. There are thousands of people across this island this afternoon who have no hearing for Christianity whatsoever, because they believe that they've seen it, and what they've seen they want nothing to do with. So sentiments like John Lennon's "Imagine" certainly ring true with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So hearing stories about, say, the white church in South Africa finding a religious justification for apartheid, or what we've just heard from you, Gareth, about some of the Northern Irish context, many people hearing these stories assume that Christianity is part of the problem, not part of the solution, and that Christians are hypocrites, and therefore that Christianity really ought to be rejected in order to improve the world. Lara, that's not the conclusion you've come to. Despite seeing some of those problems and those issues, you haven't gone down that route. Could you tell us why not, and how you've processed some of those kind of inconsistencies between what ought to be and what is?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. I think there's 3 things that have really impacted me to not come to that conclusion and just give up on religion and Christianity. The first, I think, was actually as a very young child reading. I remember reading about Jesus and being so struck at what a strong critique Jesus brought to religious people, his own people within his own faith tradition, and he never held back in sort of bowing to their prominence in society, or he was such a truth teller. And then also when I read, just when he talks about his, he sums up his whole ministry in Luke chapter 4, and he quotes from Isaiah 61. And he talks about, he says, "Spirit of the Lord is on him to bring, because he's anointed him to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for prisoners, sight for the blind, and release the oppressed." And I mean, this is the Jesus that I think still captures so many people. And yet the question is, well, is Jesus somehow different to the rest of the Bible? But then again, when I look at the absolute foundation in Genesis 1:27 for human rights and equality of all people, it's just said out there that every single human being is created in the image of God, and that's reiterated in the New Testament in Acts 17:26, and all the way through the Bible. I'm sure we'll get more into that, but I think even as a young child, I sensed that in the Bible there was this critique for, and I could see that towards the church. I could see Jesus critiquing the church on these issues and saying, this is not the God you worship, the way you're living. So I think that was powerful for me. I think a second thing that was powerful for me was actually then going on to see how and my church, I'm not saying in any way it was perfect, but there were some really important steps that then they did take, which gave me a vision for what a church that is actually inter-ethnic, cross-cultural, what that can be like, and it was beautiful. So that captivated me. And then lastly, I would just say, I think just in general, seeing myself growing as a person. And when I look back on myself 10, 20 years ago, thinking of things that I thought, things that I said, things that I might have laughed at, that I'm now sort of totally have changed on. And I think to myself, well, if I'm on such a growth journey, I feel like I can't look at other Christians in the church and say, well, I'll totally reject you, even when I myself have had to go on such a journey. And so I think for those three reasons, I've still continued to feel excited about the church and very excited about Jesus.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Gareth, can we throw it over to you then? And so you've listed some pretty horrible things that you experienced and observed with religion and culture in Northern Ireland, but you haven't completely walked away. You've done something similar perhaps to Lara. Could you tell us what that's been for you?
Yeah, well, I think the first way that I process this now and reflect on it is to simply wholeheartedly condemn a lot of the things that I saw and be utterly ashamed by it. And I do so not in spite of my Christian faith, but precisely because of it, because that's what I see Jesus doing when similar things happen in the Gospels. So I think the worst thing, the worst way that we can often respond, and this I've mentioned that this has been a response by Christians in our culture, is to try and sort of distract or mitigate against the seriousness, or do what we in Ulster call whataboutery. In other words, we sort of try and distract and mitigate against these things by sort of pointing to other things. That doesn't help whatsoever, and in fact, it's not a Christian thing to do. And also, that sort of cover up or sort of protecting people from serious scrutiny because they're on our team, as it were, it only compounds the damage and can actually make the damage much more severe than the original offence, because people feel that they've lost out on justice. So that's one initial way that I process it. I think the second thing, not to sort of undermine what I've said about whataboutery, but I began to realize as I process some of these things that as human beings, we all can do very bad things with good things, or things that are in a sense morally neutral. So, science has been used for tremendous benefit in making the world a better place, but it's also created atomic weapons and chemical weapons, and same with politics, or same with the internet. So similarly, I began to see that actually, whether it was religious or secular ideologies, all of these can have an absolutist, a divisive, and an irrational basis, and even a dangerous basis to them. Because the real issue was the human heart. And of course, that's what I discovered Jesus diagnosed the human condition as. And I guess finally then, I think one of the ways that I processed this was one of the benefits of actually being in the immediate context of somewhere like the Northern Ireland Troubles is that it helps you avoid the danger of sort of generalizations and oversimplifications when you diagnose exactly what the problems were, and maybe those who look at it from a distance can fall into that. So for myself, having been convinced that Christianity was true because of the evidence for it, and yet still having this question of what do I do with this, I found myself asking two questions. One was, is it actually true that Christianity is the real cause of the violence in Northern Ireland? And I discovered that actually it was far more complex. There were all kinds of other factors. And the second question that I asked was, okay, where evil has been perpetrated by those associated with Christianity, are those attitudes and actions a faithful product of Christian teaching itself? Are they, in fact, a perversion of those things? And more often than not, I discovered that it was the latter. Okay, so you're really kind of drawing a wedge then between authentic Christianity and some of the things done in the name of Christianity. Is that a fair summary of some of what's going on in what you're saying? And if that's the case, could you unpack that a little bit more for us, Gareth, and explain to us then how the true Christianity that you're talking about accounts for some of these moral failures done in its name? Yeah, well, whether it's a religious worldview or whether it's a secular worldview, no worldview ought to be judged by its abuse. A few years ago, in 2016, Just to illustrate this, the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 was launched, which was going to sort of make the world a better place for smartphone users. And it was recalled after a couple of weeks. The whole thing was called back because they discovered that it was dangerous by design. It had a faulty battery and was causing fires, and therefore was making the world a worse place. So they recalled the whole thing. Now, if I took another phone and sort of played about with some of the electronics with it, and then expected Apple or Samsung to recall the whole thing, they wouldn't do it, because this phone wasn't dangerous by design. It was dangerous by what I'd done with it. And I think if we're going to recall religion for the purposes of human dignity and making the world a better place, we have to be sure that it is religion itself, and Christianity in particular for me, that is the problem. And you know, if we just take the example of violence and oppression, I don't think they are a product of the Christian religion, for the simple fact that Jesus was explicit in calling his disciples against that kind of thing. He was diametrically opposed to the use of force and power in order to propagate or defend his message and his kingdom. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the disciples always got it right? No, and some of them actually proved that they weren't true disciples. In doing some of those things, Jesus said that not everybody who called him Lord, Lord was a true disciple. But even among Jesus's best disciples, they got things wrong at times, and made sort of perpetuated and propagated ideas that were completely contrary to the Christian message and the Christian method in their misunderstanding. And yet Jesus was the very first in line to call that out and not excuse it, because it mattered. The truth, not just about what the Christian message says, but also how it is to be presented to people and how people are expected to believe it, really, really matters. And Jesus wasn't prepared to let that be misrepresented, because it was too important that people received it. And of course, that was the whole question when Jesus was put on trial as a danger to society, as a religious insurrectionist to Pilate. And Pilate questioned him on the nature of his kingdom. And Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." In other words, what he was saying was, I do have a kingdom, but it doesn't come about by the normal movements of force or coercion or power that other kingdoms come about. I have come into the world, said Jesus, to bear witness to the truth, and therefore all who follow the truth will listen to my voice. And Pilate knew at that moment that Jesus wasn't a danger, because he knows that you can't allow, or you can't get people to believe in their own hearts sincerely what the truth is by force or coercion. You just can't do it. You can force people to live under your version of the truth, but you can't force them to come to a conviction about what is true for themselves unless you give the freedom and the dignity and the space to weigh up the evidence and come to their conclusions for themselves. So that has a major implication for how we propagate Christian ideas and values socially, politically, and even as parents towards our children.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. Lara, then I wonder if, in relation to some of these problems we've already mentioned, could you perhaps give us an example or two of the way the kind of the true Christianity that you are wanting to identify with is radically different from some of the ways it's been unhelpfully represented, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. And just to, I guess, link it in with what Gareth was just saying, I think the times when I have felt so excited, as I was saying, by what Christianity can offer and what it can do in the world, is to actually live out its true values, which are to say that we are not pointing to ourselves as we don't have to try and hide and always be defensive about ourselves as these paragons of virtue. No, in fact, the only way to grow is to be honest and to the Bible talks about repenting, and I've seen some people. There's an example of a woman in South Africa who, even during the apartheid regime, she was in my church. An amazing woman called Angela Kem, and she didn't try and in any way defend what white Christians have been part of and complicit in, and she was just absolutely open about how she maybe hadn't been active enough in standing up to it up until then, and that she maybe the reasons that she hadn't were because it's comfortable and it's easy, and also power dynamics are at play. And but as Gareth was just saying, this is exactly what Jesus was challenging, and he was saying that true power, if you read in Philippians 2, that God shows us that true power is not to impose or in any way exert itself over others, but true power is to serve and to lay one's life down. And these are the Christian values that Jesus came to show us. This is what God is like, and she lived that out during apartheid. And she took some hits for it in both from people in the church and people out the church, but she every weekend would go and spend time in the townships, even at great risk, because this wasn't allowed. And there were some incredible Black South African and Xhosa women in the townships who also were at risk meeting with her. And for years they just built relationship, and they were saying, we want to obey God, and we're not going to be afraid, and we're gonna stand up and do this. And they were the bedrock of what then went on to be those relationships, what enabled my church in Cape Town to become beautifully interethnic and cross-cultural eventually. So that was to me such an example of this. Another example that people might or might not have heard of, but has impacted me deeply as a child, reading the story of Corrie ten Boom in a Dutch family during the Nazi imposition of in the Netherlands, and how they again also out of conviction for their Christian faith said, we cannot go along with this, and at great risk to ourselves we are going to try to protect people that society is saying are less valuable and can be killed. And their Christian faith led them to say, we're gonna stand up like Jesus did for the oppressed and at great risk. And then she goes on to tell the story of how, having lost her own sister in the concentration camps, when they finally get caught, how then also God worked in her heart to even forgive the very commandant who had killed her sister. And to me, these are powerful stories of what Christianity is telling us about who God is and what he's calling us to be as Christians.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Gareth, the likes of Christopher Hitchens are going to wrote whole books cataloging everything wrong that was done in the name of religion, including Christianity. There's surely another side to that story, though. There's not a balanced picture. Are there ways in which Christianity has made or can make the world a better place? Is there a positive contribution? Is there a balance to that story?
I think there is, and you touch on a criticism of books like Christopher Hitchens has written that have been raised not just by Christians but by many people about just how it ignores a lot of the benefits that Christianity has brought to the world, and it's not just Christians sort of highlighting those benefits. Many people highlight them. I mean, if you take, for example, the social historian Rodney Stark, in his book The Rise of Christianity, he says one of the reasons why Christianity was so influential in the Roman Empire was because of its message gave its followers a social ethic that was just unheard of and could not be found anywhere else in any of the philosophies that dominated the empire at that time. And that was deeply appealing when the great plagues of the 2nd and the 3rd century ravaged the Roman Empire, and many of the sick and the dying were sort of left outside the city gates to sort of protect the living. It was the Christians who had a hope beyond death that were able to go and care for them and give them dignity even in dying. And of course, that's translated today in sort of medical care and hospice movements and things like that. Similarly with babies in the Roman Empire that were sort of abandoned and exposed to the elements because they were the wrong sex or because they were disabled. It was Christians who often took them in. Now, not only Christians, let's not sort of go too far and say that it was only Christians who can do these sorts of moral things. But it is simply to make the point that even atheist philosophers, if you read people like Jürgen Habermas, or indeed the historian Tom Holland in his recent book Dominion, makes the case that so many of the ideals and the values that we treasure now often as Western citizens and sort of our whole society was built upon, a lot of those emerged out of the Judeo-Christian worldview. There just wasn't a framework or a basis for it elsewhere. And it has stimulated all kinds of different movements, as I mentioned, hospital care, charity work, philanthropy, science, and the university movements. And in addition to that, there's also increasing evidence of the psychological benefit of religion. Now, that's not to say that religion can't be used to psychologically damage people, but it is also to say that a figure like Professor Andrew Sim in his book, Is Faith a Delusion, has talked extensively as a former head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists to say that the benefits of religion on psychology is one of the best kept secrets in modern psychiatry. He says, actually, if the evidence went the other way and religion was damaging to your health, then it would be on every newspaper across the land. So none of that excuses the damage and the abuses, but it is to say we need a balance in all of these things that we don't get sometimes from some of the more radical elements of the new atheism.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. Now, thank you also to all those of you who have been joining in over at Pigeonhole with the Q&A. I've got a couple more questions for Lara and Gareth before we get into your questions, but there's several good questions in there. Lara and Gareth, have you seen the questions? There's some quite testing questions in there for you coming up in a minute or so. If you would like to join in with the questions and submit a question, if you go to pigeonhole.at and type in the code SOLAS number 6 August. The amazing Tim is going to put that up on the screen now so that you can see that. If you go across there, you can vote for questions. There's quite a lot of voting going on. A few votes. I can see things moving up the chart there. And we will start with the most popular questions. So if you would like to get involved with that, do pop across to pigeonhole.at, put in SOLAS 6 August, and you can join in and shape the second half of our discussion. Before we get into your questions, though, I've got another couple of questions for Lara and Gareth. And this one, Lara, I think is a particularly important question. Lara, what would you say to someone watching this webinar today who has perhaps all but given up on even giving the Christian message a hearing because of the immorality they've witnessed in its name or experienced, you know, in the hands of those who identify with Christianity? What would you say to someone who is in that position today?
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. I think that is such an important question. And I just want to start by saying that, you know, as a Christian, that my heart absolutely breaks, and that it, when people have experienced, which so many have, and I would even say that, you know, what we're seeing now in the race conversation is such a fair critique, especially as it's coming towards the church, the Western church. And the first thing we have to say is there is so much agony that has been experienced at the hands of the church, and it's appalling, and the depth of it, I think, can't be overstated. And the church and I really want to just in a tiny way just say that if that is you, that is so important, and that as Christians we need to listen and hear and weep and really search, you know, our churches search our hearts. So, you know, if that is you, thank you even for being here and on this call. That the reason that for me, and there have been some experiences that I've also had that have been incredibly painful, specifically because they've been from people that I'd looked to as leaders in the church, or as people who I felt would maybe represent something of God's love to me. And then when you experience the opposite, it is so devastating. I think what has helped me in that journey has been seeing, again, we talked about this, but Jesus is unequivocal, and he speaks in the strongest of terms to specifically religious leaders, those who fail or those who harm in the name of religion. I mean, Jesus talks about it's some of his harshest words are used for them. He talks about it's better for them, you know, to have a millstone thrown around their neck and thrown into the sea, you know, than for them to face God. Like, I mean, he does not mince his words, and so I feel like it is absolutely important for us to follow him in that and be unequivocal with that. I think the other thing I would say that again has been helpful for me, and I hope this is helpful for you if you're listening in, again in the Old Testament, I see there are two images that I found so helpful. One, you know, and both pertaining to great leaders of the faith, you know, the heroes of the faith, Abraham. We see him. The Bible doesn't hide away from the fact that he cruelly mistreated one of his servants, a slave. She would have been of such low influence and position, and her name is Hagar. And it's so interesting to me that the Bible, God's focus in the Bible follows her after she has been terribly, cruelly mistreated by this great man of the faith. And the Bible shows us that God's attention was on her, and in the text itself prioritizes her. And then she says, "My eyes have seen the one who sees me." That image of a God who sees the oppressed. I mean, you cannot miss that in the Old Testament. It is all the way through. This is the heart of the God of the Bible. Another example is again a great leader, King David, you know, lauded as this kind of great hero of the faith, and yet he also And it doesn't hide the fact that he cruelly, again, mistreats a woman, Bathsheba, and her husband, has him killed in order that he can abuse and just take power over this woman. And again, God does not stand by. He sends his prophet and he challenges David with those famous words that Nathan then says to him after telling him a story that mimics what David has just done. And David is then shocked and angered and saying, oh, that's a terrible story. And then Nathan the prophet says, you are that man. And there's this image of God confronting leaders. And the Bible is very clear that there is, God is a God of justice. And I think we're talking a lot about that on this call because, you know, we haven't talked a lot about forgiveness, and forgiveness is absolutely at the center of the Christian message. Jesus talks so much about forgiveness, but he also talks about justice. Justice and forgiveness are absolutely brought together at the cross and within the Bible. And I think the church has been, in the last however many years, really light on justice, especially when looking at ourselves, which the Bible is constantly asking us to do. And I think that's why on this call, I'm so glad that we're focusing there.
That's very helpful. Again, Gareth, we talked about, you know, sins and failures, and amongst those calling themselves Christians. We've also touched on in the last sort of 15 minutes or so, the idea that Christianity has a power to change us at the deepest level. Could you perhaps then think of an example or a story of what it looks like in practice that the power of Christianity and the power of Christ can come into someone's life and make a positive difference and maybe move them away from some of those hateful attitudes and in the right direction? I think you have a particular example in mind, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I've given some sort of abstract examples of how Christianity has changed the world on the big scale, but it really only does, Gavin, because Jesus promised that those who truly repent and follow him will be changed at the deepest level of their hearts. And I ask myself, what can change the human heart? Because I agree with Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he said the dividing line, the real problem and danger in this world is that the dividing line between every human heart, or the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And in that sense, I know in my own life, and I think if we're all honest, we all have that potential to make the world a much worse place, certainly for the people around us, by our choice and attitudes. And the example that I'm thinking of in terms of that level of change, because that promise of Jesus is empirically testable and many have experienced it. And let me just leave you with one very quick one. A friend and mentor of mine called Tom Tarrants. Tom's in his 70s. He lives in America. Lara knows him as well. He's the most gentle, humble, godly man that you would ever meet. And when you do meet him and discover his story, there's a fair degree of cognitive dissonance when you discover that in his 20s, he was one of the most wanted right-wing terrorists in the United States, a man consumed with hatred and prejudice towards Jews and members of the Black community and socialists as well, so much so that it took him towards violence. He tried to blow up the home of a prominent Jewish leader in his community and ended up in one of the maximum security prisons. And even that wasn't enough to sort of change his heart. But eventually he began to open himself up and pursue the truth. Jesus said, all who are of the truth will listen to my voice. And that began to disarm some of these prejudices as he got out of the echo chamber. But it also began to reveal to him that the Christianity that he thought he knew growing up in Alabama and that fueled some of this prejudice was radically different. It was diametrically opposed. And he was radically changed to the point where some of those he was most against and had the greatest prejudice for are now his friends and people he deeply loves and cares for. And the change was real. Of course, there was the skepticism at the beginning. Oh, you know, the guy in prison's got religion in order to lessen his term. But this is now 50 years ago, to the point where some of the people he hurt most, some of those who are involved in government and knew his story, came to him to sort of find out whether this was actually true. And 50 years later, it is still true, because as the Times writer and atheist Matthew Paris once wrote in a reflective article on his own experience of Christianity in Africa, he said, Christianity changes people and the transformation is real. And that is a good thing.
Well, Lara, Gareth, thank you for kind of setting this conversation off in motion. It's been really stimulating and really helpful. We're going to go across to the Q&A now. There's some really good questions in here. And as we've said before, if you go across to Pigeonhole, you can join in this conversation and shape where we're going next. I'm going to start with you, Gareth, though. There's a really helpful question that's come in at the top, which is kind of building on some of the things you said earlier on. Darren has said, surely there is a huge difference between religion and being in union with Christ and living for him. Gareth?
I think that's really at the heart of this entire issue, Gavin. I think it's a brilliant question and a deeply important one. We've got to get to the crux of what is Christianity all about, and are there distinctions there between those who associate with Christianity, and I'm sort of focusing on Christianity because I can't speak for all religions, but are there differences there between some of the things that have been done in the name of Christianity and those who are faithfully living out Jesus's mandate for how we ought to live and living as he lived? And that's what I would encourage anyone who's at any point in this journey or asking this question, or has been hurt or disillusioned by Christianity, who thinks they've seen it and they're repulsed by it. I would just encourage us all to take a look once again at Jesus and really base our measure of what Christianity really is according to him and to what he says, and not how people have perhaps perverted it. I think there is a real disunity, and there is a real difference between sort of cultural Christianity, and I know that very well, growing up in a place where Christianity was in a sense in the water, but there's a radical difference between those sort of forms of religion and the real power of God in a person's life, because a person's being obedient to Jesus. And it's only those people that Jesus himself said are true followers. Again, he says in the Gospels, very clear with people, not all who identify me as Lord will actually inherit the kingdom. So it's only those who take his words and put it into practice, repent and live out by the power of the Holy Spirit his mandate for living, that actually are true Christians. And so when we're measuring what Christianity really is and whether it makes the world a better place or a worse place, let's make sure that we're going back to first principles and asking that question and drawing our conclusions from the real source, not from maybe straw man examples or the extremes of how people have perverted it, as difficult and real as those experiences are for people.
Okay, can I just pick up on one thing you said on that, Gareth, before we come to the next question? You said take a look at Jesus. How would somebody do that? What would be the mechanism? How would someone take a look at what you're kind of picturing as the authentic Jesus? Where would somebody go to do that?
Yeah, well, the best way, if you want to do it yourself, is to just simply open one of his biographies, the Gospel. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are eyewitness biographies of Jesus's life and death and resurrection. So again, the good researchers go to the original sources when they want to identify things, and those are the original sources, certainly for the Christian message. Now, you can do that on your own if you don't want to do it with other people, but you can also join certain groups, and there are certain courses that will help you do that, allow you to explore your questions, and no question hopefully will be off limits in the context of other people, other questioners, maybe people who have become a Christian but just starting out in that journey, and other people who like engaging with questions and have thought through these things themselves and might be able to sort of help clarify some things. So I'm thinking of alpha courses and Christianity Explored and things like that. But there really are opportunities there, and if we're going to be serious about what we do with Christianity, then let's be serious enough to make sure that our judgments are based on the right thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Lara, can I put a hard question to you? Welcome to our Q&A. It's the first one you've done with us, so I'm going to throw a really difficult one for you here. Steve M writes this: so everything nice is true Christianity, but everything nasty isn't the real thing. Isn't that just selecting the evidence that supports your conclusion? Lara?
Great. Well, I just, again, want to start by saying I think that is a brilliant question, and it's a really fair question. I think it shows me it's someone who's wanting to actually pursue truth, and so I think I really appreciate it. I think the first thing that occurs to me, though, is actually even the moral categories that we assume, in a question like that everything nice there are certain things that we can just say are, and I mean, I'm extrapolating a little bit, but everything nice, that there's an assumption that we all agree on what are moral absolutes and what's good in society. I mean, it's a tired example, but I mean, if you do go to Nazi Germany, I mean, there was an assumption in society at that time that Jewish people were, they were less than, and we could treat them in certain ways. And I guess we actually need moral absolutes in order to say, if I was a German living in that society, I might have thought that that's a nice thing. This is part of my understanding, my worldview. So actually, even when we're talking about nice things, good things, true things, those ideas are relative based on where you're growing up and what generation and what time. I guess what I would just say to this is that when you read the Bible, it's saying some very clear things. For example, it's saying very clearly that God is a God of justice, not a God of injustice. So that God is a God who lifts up the oppressed, not a God who says it's okay to oppress. I mean, we could talk about whether or not you feel like you could read the Bible and get a different message. I think my understanding of that is that it's really clear. I know we do live in a relatively postmodern world still, especially when it comes to literature. I studied literature alongside history at university, but I think that when we're reading texts, you can read a book and generally say, look, it's about this and not about that, even though you might want to interpret slightly different things differently. Overall, there's a message that it's proclaiming, and I would say the Bible is totally in that category. It's proclaiming a very clear message about who God is. So I guess someone who's asking this question, I think it's a really good one. I just challenge them to read the Bible and say, okay, as you read the whole sweep of scripture, and as you read, and if you don't have time to do all of that, but you just want to really get the heart of it, Gareth mentioned, reading a gospel, the Bible's again really clear that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So if you want to know what the creator of the world is like according to Christianity, you just have to look at Jesus. So you can kind of truncate your studies a bit if you want. And that will give you an image of who God is. And I think Jesus in his life and teaching is incredibly consistent in his values. And so that's what we've been saying, I guess, on this call, is that we can measure our thoughts and our actions according to Jesus and see where I'm wrong, and then critique myself according to what I'm seeing about the nature of God and how he's encouraging it and telling us as followers of him that we have to live to, if we want to be like God and we want to understand who God is. So I think it's something that I would say, don't take my word for it, but please go, read for yourself. And I'm sure there's many of us, if Steve, whoever you are, if you would love to take that conversation forward with us after you've done that, I know I'd be very happy to. I'm sure Gareth would as well.
Excellent. Can I stay with you, Lara? Because there's a question that's come up here, which is stepping into the whole area of whether Christianity and religion more broadly is essentially misogynistic and anti-women. And I know that's something you've thought about. So I'll read the whole question, but I wonder if you could have a think about this one. I'll read the whole question, which is anonymously submitted. It says, the three Abrahamic religions have a major preoccupation with food and sex. There's no sidestepping the misogyny and anti-women sentiments. How do we rationalize that?
Okay, again, I'll just reiterate something Gareth said, that I won't speak for the other Abrahamic faiths, just for Christianity. Although I take your point, and there's a lot of actually overlap in some of the texts. But what I would say about Christianity is, again, Christianity is, I've even mentioned some of those examples that, might have come to your mind about great heroes of the faith in the Bible mistreating women. And this was a really big personal issue for me. I remember at 16, once going into my room, closing the door, and I'd kind of been avoiding certain texts that I found difficult in the Bible, and just realizing that as a Christian, I couldn't do that. And I opened them, and I just remember crying and actually kneeling down in my bedroom and praying and asking God to show me, because I said, God, are you endorsing this? This is your word. Is this how you see me as a woman? And I felt angry. And you know what? The thing that I now feel so convinced about is that anger is right, and that it is, just as we've been saying in this whole call, that the Bible is clear that God values every single person. And so when I have experienced being and actually even internalized a sense of being lesser than, and I think that's a very important point to think about when we're talking to people who have felt mistreated, to realize that can be a degree of internalization of that that lesser value, and that can be a long journey. And actually coming to a place of anger is really important to recognize that's not true. It's not right. That's never how God intended it to be. And again, the Bible is actually giving me the framework in which to understand that. Mm-hmm. That there's intrinsic value, and my value doesn't come from being able to wield power in certain ways. It's intrinsic to who I am, right. And it was so important for me to go on that journey from a biblical perspective, trying to understand the text. The way the Christians understand the Bible is that the Bible is a faithful narrative of humans and God's interaction with them, and so the Bible doesn't in any way try to whitewash or cover over human evil. And this is exactly what we've been saying. And the people of God themselves are caught up in many ways in the evils that we see in this world of mistreating women, or people from outside the group, or people who for whatever reason are seen to be less than. But all the way through, again, if we read the Bible, we see that God is challenging that all the way through. And I think the question is, why doesn't God just should he just do away with people when they have treated people terribly? And I think that's a fair question. I mean, sometimes we have that feeling like if groups of people have been so mistreated, if God really cares, wouldn't he just wipe out those people who have mistreated those other people? And again, that could be a question in the Bible. Why doesn't he just wipe out those leaders who are misogynistic towards women? And the answer that I've come to in the Bible is that he is a God who does confront, but it also says that he is slow to anger towards all of us. And the Bible kind of asks me as a woman to think, when I have experienced misogyny, when I've experienced mistreatment, can I say that I have never mistreated anyone? Can I say that I've never looked at people and looked down on them or thought that they're less than? And the Bible's never saying that what I've experienced as a woman is right. In fact, no, it's wrong. And again, just very quickly, I would say, look to Jesus, because I mean, I could preach a whole sermon on how Jesus totally goes against the culture of his day, which was actually even worse. The Greek culture was even more misogynistic than the ancient cultures in the Old Testament that we see. But Jesus stood against that, and he had female disciples. He specifically gave examples from the world of women when he was teaching to include them. He had women paying for his ministry, which was again kind of really looked down on. Women were the major players in the major 3 moments in the New Testament: at the incarnation, at the crucifixion, at the resurrection. It was women. So if Jesus again is showing us who God is, then he is absolutely showing us that women, just like men, are absolutely equally loved and valued by God. As you can see, I can keep going, but maybe I'll just stop there again. But I really hear it, and I think it's an important question, because again, it asks the question of the character and the nature of God. And I just want to say that when you've seen that and you feel it's unjust and wrong, my understanding is that is exactly what you should be feeling, and that's what the Bible encourages us to feel.
Excellent, thank you. There are some other questions we need to get to as well, but that was really good. Thank you for that. Gareth, I've got one for you here. This is quite an insightful question. I wonder if you could chew around this one on a very different topic than the last one. Christians get accused of not listening to atheist reasoning by hiding behind atheism's awful record of intolerance, gulags, killing fields, etc. Do atheists do the same with Christian arguments?
Great question. I mean, I concur with the start of the question, because it was my experience. I think, again, growing up in Northern Ireland, what I said at the beginning was that we can be quite partisan, and we were a polarized society, and therefore we stereotyped and we misrepresented other people, and we played culture wars. And one of the problems with that was the one thing that didn't lend itself to was to real engagement with other people. So we justified ourselves in order to feel good, and we only sort of represented the good things about our own particular group. And then in a sense, we demonized the other in order to justify ourselves even further. And it's just, it's impossible to do. It's not unique to religion by any means. All you have to do is look at British or American politics. But it is a common problem. I mean, when it came to the arguments of atheism, I remember being a very sincere Christian and being confronted for the first time with atheism arguments in the sixth form centre in school, and I'd never heard them. Never even mind sort of thought of an answer. I'd never heard them before. And I see that actually as a bit of an indictment on my sort of Christian experience up to that time. I'd never been exposed to alternative worldviews. Now, obviously, I since have, and I'm still convinced, but I think this comes back to the real issue of how open to the truth are we? Again, what is the nature of Jesus's message and how his kingdom is to be advanced and defended? And he says, those who are of the truth will listen to my voice. And that's a human dignifying statement, not an affirming, because so many people, whether it's through military force, whether it's through political coercion or social coercion, so many people are conditioned into believing what they believe rather than having thought through it. And yet Jesus says that's not to be the way anybody becomes a Christian. So I think we can do both. I think we can set up straw men and play sort of all kinds of logical fallacies in order to justify our own position. And I would just ask us as Christians or as atheists, how open really are we to the truth? Because there are all sorts of other factors at play as to why we might not be as open to the truth as we think. I mean, Pilate got a front row seat to have a conversation with Jesus and investigate him on some of the questions that we've been looking at. And he exonerated him, but he still crucified him. Not because he thought that he was a religious fundamentalist and a danger, but simply because of the peer pressure from the Jewish people. And he didn't want an uprising, and he wanted to maintain favor with Emperor Tiberius. So there are other factors as to why we might not be open to pursuing the truth, both as Christians and not. But I think certainly, speaking as a Christian, my life and my actual conviction that Christianity is true has been enriched in all sorts of ways by engaging with atheist arguments and with people who do not share my worldview. And of course, I get that mandate from Jesus himself. So rather than sort of play these culture wars and demonize in order to easily shoot down other people, I think we need to be really open to the truth, including as Christians, and not just sort of drink the Kool-Aid, but really investigate this stuff. Because if Christianity is true, it will not become untrue by us investigating it thoroughly and by engaging with arguments that maybe, are designed to discredit it. So I would encourage all of us.
Gareth, that's your microphone just cut out. Still off.
How's that?
It's back on again. Keep going.
Finally, just to say, I would just encourage us, how open and honest are we in our pursuit of the truth, wherever it takes us?
That's helpful again. Thank you for that. Lara, can I throw this one across to you then? Steve writes, can Christianity make me a better person? How? And there's a comment underneath that just says, no, it can't, in the comments. So, maybe you want to pick up on both those things. Or is it Christianity or is it Christ himself? I wonder if you want to delve into some of those things for us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that Jesus said in the gospel, I think it's in Luke 7, he says, do not judge lest you be judged. And it's an interesting, in the context of what he's saying, I think I have taken that to mean, and what I've understood from Jesus' teachings, and what I try to, live by as a Christian, is that my assessment of someone's growth and of their kind of increasing moral virtuousness or lack thereof is probably going to be very flawed. It's going to be very tainted or influenced by my personality, what I've seen of them, what I haven't. And so I don't think it's possible for us to have a very clear picture of what's in other people's hearts. And so I think, sometimes I have thought, I want to look around at the church and think, well, by and large, are people getting better? And almost use that as like a bit of a litmus test for whether or not Christianity is true. And at times I've looked and I've thought, yeah, I would say that's true. And at other times I think, I just want to if that's the litmus test for whether or not Christianity is true, I think that's not true, because, it just feels like people are getting worse. And I would say the same for myself when I've tried to kind of gauge, am I becoming more kind of like godly, or, is my heart becoming more like Jesus? The days I think, yeah, I think it is. And the next day I think, no, I'm getting worse. So all that to say, actually, I don't think that we can easily tell. But one thing that I have seen, and I would just say for myself, is that the more that I spend time with God, the more that I, read the Bible, the more I pray, what I do find is that there is like and I guess the Bible talks about our conscience, and that there is an increasingly like sort of uncomfortableness when I'm gossiping, or when I'm saying something cruel, or when I'm being callous or careless. It's not that I don't do those things anymore. I do, but there's like something in me that just is like, this is not like, and I can't sit with it anymore. And I want to pray about that, and I want to change. And that is just a personal testimony, I would say, from my life, and what I have heard other Christians saying. And that to me has been an exciting part of the journey, that I feel like there's something that's almost like coming to life inside me, and that the Bible describes that as the work of the Holy Spirit. But again, and I would maybe just end. Sorry, I know I'm quoting scripture a lot, and this is obviously my views as a Christian. But St. Paul in the New Testament also says that, he says, I don't primarily listen to those voices who are judging me. I don't primarily even listen to the judgments of myself, on myself. But I stand before God, and I look to Him as the only one who can see what's really going on in me. And I just keep going on the journey, knowing that He has promised that He loves me. And that's kind of what the Bible tells us. And I think it helps Christians, and it should help us to stay humble, and not say that, oh, look at me, I'm this paragon of virtue, but to walk with God in that. But the Bible does promise that as we do that, He will make us more like God. But whether or not we can actually see that, the side of heaven, is another matter.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we've got time maybe for one more, maybe two more at the most, Gareth. Okay, Reinder writes this question. We've probably got time for a quick answer on this one, Gareth, even though it's a big problem. Critiquing, in fact, the title of our webinar today. Reinder writes, why would religion be the problem? Isn't the real problem intrinsically in humans? Without religion, there would still be in and out groups, so I don't see how that's going to change without religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that puts a finger on precisely the Christian diagnosis of our human problem, that actually we all have this ability, whether we identify things as religion, we all have this ability to ultimatize certain ideas, certain perspectives, certain ethnicities, certain cultural things, and in doing so, discriminate and have prejudicial views towards those who are different. And to be honest, that we've made a case for how that's not authentic Christianity today. But it's not to say that this change of heart is not an ongoing process and Christians make mistakes. And I think even in terms of the sort of Jew-Gentile conflict, the Bible's very open that took time, and people made mistakes and people got things wrong. These things need to be worked through. We all have that propensity in our human hearts. And it just sort of draws me back to, okay, if it's not necessarily about religious ideologies, but actually it's about us as human beings and what we do with them, and our potential not to just ultimatize ideas, but ultimately to set ourselves up as God, as it were. That's exactly the problem that the Bible diagnosed, but it's also the solution that Christianity offers, that actually there is something that can reach us at the deepest level and truly change our hearts. It's one of the great promises of the New Testament that, of the Old Testament, that would come in following Jesus, was that the right way to live, God's laws, as much as they were sort of written on stone, and that sort of ethical code of the Old Testament that was helping people to live in the right way, even though they necessarily didn't want to, that would now be written on people's hearts, and what people would know God personally, and they would know how to live in the right way. And obviously that's a process, but it's an incredible promise. I think it's unique to any worldview or political mandate that I'm certainly aware of. And therefore, I would just encourage us to take it seriously, because, as I said earlier, it's also an empirically checkable promise. And as much as, there have been mistakes and people have made all kinds of different abuses and perversions of Christianity, there are plenty who have taken Jesus at his word and followed it out and been radically transformed. And even those who've made some of the greatest mistakes, have found in Christianity a forgiveness and a level of power at the deepest level of their being that can radically transform them personally and make their world around them, their immediate world, and then the world beyond that, a much better place. I think that's definitely worth looking into.
Thank you so much for those things. Now, Gareth and Lara both mentioned a few things in the course of the answers that they've been giving during the last hour. Just sort of recap on a few of those. They did mention Alpha and Christianity Explored courses online as a way of exploring the authentic Christian faith and focusing on Jesus and a place to ask your questions. So if you wanted to pick up on that, you could look at alpha.org.uk/try alpha. That's one way of exploring these things further. And another way is christianityexplored.org. So you could look at Alpha or Christianity Explored. They're both online courses. So I hope you to dig a little bit deeper and ask some questions about the authentic Christian faith that Lara and Gareth have been talking about during the last hour. Gareth also mentioned Tom Tarrance and his story about how he was transformed by the gospel and how he started off as a right-wing terrorist and ended up as an advocate for racial reconciliation. That's Tom Tarrance's book there. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, Consumed by Hate, but Redeemed by Love. That's a good read. Another book I'd like to recommend to you in closing is this one. This is called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Hardest Religion by Rebecca McLaughlin. Picks up on many of the themes that we've been talking about today and provides some really insightful and helpful answers. So there is a couple of things that you could follow up on if you want to take some of the things we've been discussing in the last hour a little bit further. That just remains for me to say thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for watching. Thank you, as always, to Gareth for joining us, and also to Lara for coming in and joining us for the first time. We do hope that you will come back. Thank you also to Tim Allen, our amazing producer behind the scenes, for holding this all together. We do hope that you found the last hour helpful and productive, and we hope that this will help you in your search for truth. And our prayer, of course, is that you will find that in Jesus Christ. May God bless you, and goodbye. Thank you for joining us.